Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we begin today, I want to provide updates both on what's taking place in the Middle East and in Gaza, also in Ukraine, because events are transpiring in a very accelerated way, and it's very important for us to pay attention to what's happening. I want to start with Israel, and I want to draw a parallel between what's happening in Israel internally inside Israel, which we don't note very often, with what's going on in the domestic situation in the United States. In one of the major Israeli papers today, Haaretz, they were saying that Israel has reached its Weimar moment. That was the moment when democracy failed in Germany in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and Hitler took over, and we all know what happened as a result of that. The Netanyahu government, which has been in perpetual war since Netanyahu first came into the prime ministership back in 1996, unsettling the Middle Eastern balance of power, culminating, as we've seen, in the genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. That's exacted a great price inside Israel. Tens of thousands of Israelis have been displaced because of the war on Gaza. Freedom of speech has been curtailed. Political corruption that was nipping at Netanyahu's heels in terms of court cases have been postponed, although some of them continue. He has just fired the head of Shin Bet, which is sort of the Israeli equivalent to the American FBI, similar to Trump essentially taking over and weaponizing the Justice Department and the FBI as he's doing in the United States. Netanyahu is assaulting verbally the Attorney General, who was protesting against the firing of Shin Bet, and bringing Ben-Gvir back into the Israeli coalition that is governing. Ben-Gvir has been one of the most extreme elements in the Israeli government, the Israeli society. He resigned from the cabinet when Netanyahu agreed to a ceasefire, which was demanded by Donald Trump, so that he could be inaugurated as president with a relative semblance of peace. And I think what's important to note is that the attack on democracy, which always happens after prolonged war and the exigencies of conflict, is taking place in Israel, almost in parallel to what's happening here in the United States. It's an extraordinary parallelism between Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. The one aspect that I think is very important for all of us to take in is that Benjamin Netanyahu so completely controls American politics, the White House, the Senate, the House, the media, that even while Donald Trump is trying to find a way out in Ukraine, because the United States has lost that war. Donald Trump is escalating the war with Netanyahu in the Middle East. A day before yesterday, the United States sent uh, warplanes and missiles into Yemen to attack the Houthis. The Houthis are being called terrorists by Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, echoing the line of the Israelis. And I want to just take a moment about the Houthis. Yemen is a very, very poor country. It's been manipulated and colonized and in all kinds of ways exploited. The Houthis are a radical group, to be sure. They are in alignment with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, the so-called axis of resistance, because they're situated right there at the mouth of the Red Sea. They have control over the shipping lanes. And they said from the beginning of the genocide against the Palestinians that they would resist Israel and the United States until they stopped. And they've been blocking shipping, doing an extraordinary job. They've been repeatedly attacked. They come out of their tunnels because Yemen, particularly in that area, is very mountainous and very, very hard to attack in any significant way. They stopped with the ceasefire. And then when Israel began to starve Palestine by cutting off food, water, electricity, any kind of aid, the Houthis announced that they would let all the ships go and come except for the Israeli ships until the Israelis stopped the blockade. So we're not talking here about terrorists. Those are terms of art that are used to manipulate people's perception of reality. Because once you identify someone as a terrorist, then you can do anything you want against them with a clear conscience because you're eliminating vermin. You're eliminating subhumans. You're eliminating someone that is not you. But the Houthis are us. And they're standing up, as many people are, against what's going on. Donald Trump's press secretary yesterday signaled that the Trump administration is giving full support to the Israeli escalation, is moving 3 aircraft carriers into the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean, armed with nuclear weapons. And as Marco Rubio yesterday and Tim Waltz, the national security advisor, said, this is a warning to Iran. And I want to just note that, then I'll move to Ukraine. Remember that from 1996 onward, Benjamin Netanyahu has been manipulating the United States to not only sow unrest in the Middle East, but indicated 7 nations that needed to be taken out: Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, Somalia, and Iran. 6 out of those 7 countries have been devastated by the United States and the Israelis. And what Benjamin Netanyahu wants more than anything else is for the United States to attack Iran. And that is something that we all need to understand is now in motion. And the collaboration between Trump and Netanyahu will be very similar to the collaboration of every US president with Netanyahu over the last 30 years. Except that while Joe Biden publicly equivocated, because at some level he knew what he was doing was wrong, Kamala Harris certainly did. With Donald Trump, there's not a shred of conscience. So when he says that there's going to be hell to pay, we should believe that that's actually the case. President Trump and President Putin had a 2-hour conversation yesterday. There's been much speculation about that. What is beginning to emerge is what Jeffrey Sachs said in the interview that we had, and others have commented, is that there's no ceasefire. As much as the Americans would like a ceasefire, the Russians aren't agreeing to a ceasefire because they're winning. They've completely eliminated the Ukrainians from the Kursk region. According to reports in some of the Russian telegram channels and podcasts, Putin has ordered the Russian troops now to move into the Sumy region in northern Ukraine. And if they take Sumy, there is just open territory toward Kiev. And the Russian troops in the south are moving north from the Zaporozhye region, where the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, one of the largest in the world, is situated under Russian control. The Russians apparently have agreed for a temporary ceasefire against some of the energy facilities. So Trump could get a little bit of something. But as I've said multiple times, there is no question about who's in charge here. It's Vladimir Putin, and it's the Russians. That's how wars end. Somebody wins and somebody loses. And the losers aren't given very many options because they've lost. They have to take what the victor gives them. Just think of Germany at the end of the Second World War. There were no negotiations. The Germans tried to negotiate, but the Allies said, no, you're done. And then they carved up Germany, as we all know. So when we are following the news, it's very important for us to pay attention to language. When someone's called a terrorist, like the Houthis, let us just ask, terrorist to who? For what reason? Maybe we would be doing exactly the same thing if we were in their shoes. When we think about the collapse of democracy as nations convulse in perpetual war, We need to understand that what's taking place are inevitable historical processes that allow no survivors. There's no democracy in history that has survived perpetual war. That's what brought down Athens 2,500 years ago, the beacon of democracy in the world, succumbing to the Peloponnesian War, and then collapsing into tyranny. It's interesting to note that the Peloponnesian War has lasted about as long as the tenure of Benjamin Netanyahu, and Israel is collapsing into tyranny, right-wing extremist tyranny. And in the United States, after a century or more of perpetual war, the inevitabilities of the corrosion, the dilapidation that happens to the institutions becomes an inevitability. And we talk about what we can do to remedy it tactically here and there. But if strategically that's the trajectory of a nation, there's virtually nothing anyone can do about it in a meaningful political way. And at one level, that brings great sorrow to all of us. But at another level, knowing the constraints of what is possible and what is not possible empowers one to make the right decisions. And I would like to close with something I've mentioned before, but which is more and more in my mind. And that's the great achievement of Saint Benedict and the Benedictine orders in the 4th century, witnessing the collapse of the Roman Empire. Saint Benedict knew there was nothing he could do about it. But there was one thing he could do. And he sent his monks throughout the empire, and they gathered books and manuscripts from antiquity and hid them away in the monasteries. He could see that the barbarians were massing at the frontier. And he did what he could to preserve the civilization of antiquity. And much of what we study today comes from that simple act of Saint Benedict. So there's a lot that we can do in this time. Our task is to discern with ruthless realism the context for our actions so that we can ensure that the transactions we make, the actions we take, will further the cause at a deeper level of the historical process itself. I talked about the State of the World Forum yesterday. I talked about other things that we're doing that are of value. Many of you are doing things of infinite value. And we need to persist in taking the stands that we can, while being discerning in knowing where taking a stand is actually futile. And that's what I think Jesus meant when he says you have to be as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here on humanity rising as we grapple with these kinds of complexities